So closely related is the concept of monotonic preferences, and with monotonicity it implies indifference curves have negative slope and the consumer would always prefer averages over extremes, right? So the consumer would prefer a given combination of some amount of X1 and X2 and would not necessarily move to extremes of consuming just one of the commodities. So basically here we can tell that lower bundles offer worse satisfaction, lower satisfaction to the consumer. So the bundles to the left of this indifference curves are worse bundles and better bundles are here, and your typical consumer normally would be operating within the middle of this indifference curves because we are assuming that they are choosing averages over extremes, right? So having discussed the consumer preferences, now we need to note what the consumer will be able to afford, because if wishes were horses, beggars would rise. So here we want to look at whether the consumer is able to afford what is available, that is based on his or her budget. So here we take a scenario where Lisa has a budget of Y, right, that she has to spend on pizza and burger for every semester. Here we assume that she is neither saving nor borrowing. So her expenditure on burger plus her expenditure on pizza would be equal to her total income at the end of the semester, assuming she's only consuming these two goods. Okay, so in terms of looking at how Lisa allocates her budget, we'll see that this is total expenditure on pizza and burger and total expenditure on pizza is equal. So if we want to know the maximum amount of burger Lisa can have, it will be Y minus the expenditure on pizza divided by the price of burger. But if we assume that she will not consume any pizza, then it means that the maximum amount of burgers she can have per semester would be her total income divided by the price of burgers. Right, so here we try to use some numbers to see how she allocates her income, which is equal to $50. Price of pizza is $1 and the price of burger is $2, right? So basically this will be her budget constraint for the purchase of burgers. So here, if we assume that Lisa spends all her budget on burgers, burger costs $2, it means that she has 50 cedis, so she can have a maximum of how many? 25 pieces of burgers. Then when it comes to pizza, the same idea applies. It costs $1, so she has 50, she can have 50 slices of pizza. Then when we join these 2 points together, it gives us Lisa's budget constraints, right? So all points on this budget constraint are attainable. She can afford them based on her budget. And opportunity set is basically points that are within and on top of the budget constraint. That is, all the bundles that Lisa can afford are in her opportunity set. Right. So let's look at a scenario where there's a change in the price of one of the commodities. And here we see that the price of pizza doubles. With an increase in the price of pizza, it was initially $1. She could buy 50 with her $50. Now, pizza is $2. She can only buy 25. So the price of burger is not changing. You see a rotation of the budget line along the point of the burger, the intercept of the burger commodity. So here you can see that Lisa loses this whole point, is a loss to her because she loses it due to the increase in the price of pizza, right? The same principle would apply when there is an increase in her income, right? Assuming Lisa's income doubles, it means she can afford more of both commodities. So this whole area is a gain to her due to an increase in her income. So how does a consumer reach equilibrium? Equilibrium, we know for one commodity case, was a situation where the price ratios are equal, right? So here, how does this consumer reach equilibrium? Let's see how we can find the slope of this budget constraint. And the slope of the budget constraint here would be the relative price ratios, right? The relative price ratios. So the slope of this would be the price of burger over the price of pizza, right? That is the slope, and it's always negative to show is a downward sloping curve that we are dealing with, right? So in terms of equilibrium, it means that we are equating the slope of the indifference curve to the slope of the budget constraint, right? The point of tangency between the indifference curve and the budget constraint is where the consumer is in equilibrium. So here we know the slope of this budget constraint is what? The relative price ratios, and the slope of this indifference curve would be the rate of substitution between goods X and Y, right? So that gives us the consumer equilibrium, where Lisa is at equilibrium by consuming a given amount of quantity of burritos and quantity of what? Pizzas. So here we see that the marginal utility of good Z over the marginal utility of good B is equal to the price of good Z over the price of good B. And this is the marginal rate of substitution between goods Z and B. So at this point, this is the slope of the indifference curve, right? This is the slope of the indifference curve, and this is the slope of the budget constraints, right? So there are situations where a given consumer, we want to see why the consumer will pick a point of equilibrium where there is a tangent position. So look at this point, at Y here, we'll see that there is a disequilibrium, but somebody would ask, why would the consumer not settle here? The consumer will not settle here because at this point, the marginal utility, the ratio of the marginal utilities, which is the slope of the indifference curve, is greater than the relative price ratio. So this consumer would benefit by consuming more of one good and reducing consumption of the other, so their satisfaction increases and brings them to this point, right? So here too, in a scenario where we have point V, we see that the relative price ratios, the slope of the budget constraint, is greater than the slope of the indifference curve. So this consumer would be better off by reducing the consumption of X1 and increasing the consumption of X2 to move to the point of equilibrium where we are at point U. There are other scenarios where the consumer cannot do anything about this point of equilibrium, and we call that the corner solution. So in that scenario, we see that equilibrium point is at a corner here where the consumer is only consuming good X2 and not consuming any of X1 based on the type of the product we are looking at and the shape of the indifference curve, right? So this is also another scenario where there is what? A corner solution, and this is a situation where we have perfect substitute. That is our Coke and Pepsi example that we use. Another scenario would be, instead of your point of tangency between the budget constraint and the indifference curve, this is a concave indifference curve. Satisfaction increases when the consumer moves to a corner, right? And this is with a strictly concave indifference curve. The individual will be better off by being at the corner where they are consuming only one commodity. Okay, so having discussed the budget constraints, we'll introduce quickly taxes, subsidies, and rationing, right? So we know that in general, government imposes taxation to raise revenue for the daily administration of the country, and taxes reduce the disposable income available to people to spend. So here we are looking at three different types of taxes, where we are looking at the quantity or specific tax, ad valorem tax, and the lump sum tax. And when it comes to subsidies, the same principle applies, like the taxation, and then rationing as well. So in terms of looking at quantity tax, it's a tax that is imposed on per unit of a commodity that is bought. So you buy a basket of tomatoes, you are asked to pay 50 pesos as taxation. That is a quantity tax. So the more you buy, the more you pay. But here it is not a percentage, it is a value that is imposed. So the tax, the price of the commodity, which was originally PX, would now be PX plus T, which is the value of the tax. And this will act just like an increase in price. So it will rotate the budget line inwards. And the slope of the new budget line, which originally was minus P1 over P2, would now be minus P1 prime, where P1 prime is P1 plus T, which is the tax over P2. Right, so that is what we need to know, that the slope of the budget line will change due to the imposition of the tax. With an ad valorem tax, on the other hand, it is a percentage of the price of the commodity, and this is like your VAT, your typical VAT is a percentage of the price of the commodity. So that means that the new price of the commodity now becomes 1 plus the tax, which is a percentage, multiplied by the price of the commodity, right? So the slope of the new budget line becomes minus 1 minus into bracket 1 plus T, all multiplying the price of PX divided by the price of Y, where good X is the good on which the tax has been imposed. The same principle would apply. It will be a rotation of the budget line inwards because the price becomes expensive, but the slope is different from the quantity tax, right? That is the only difference you need to know. And then with the lump sum tax, it's a fixed amount that you pay as tax by an individual, right? It doesn't depend on income, it doesn't depend on price or anything. So this just acts directly as a reduction in the income of the individual. So it shifts the budget line inwards due to the reduction in the income available to the individual. So in terms of the subsidies, they act similar to the taxation but in opposite direction. So I would ask you to do the review for subsidies yourself using this knowledge that you have in taxation. Then when it comes to rationing, rationing is a scenario where you have money to buy the product, but per policy, due to unavailability of the product or anything, you cannot purchase the quantity you want to purchase, right? So here, this is the typical budget line of the individual based on the preamble that I presented in slide 38. We see that the individual here is demanding water, and based on his budget, he can afford 12,000 gallons of water a month, but because of the need to distribute water to everybody, right, government restricts availability of water. That is rationing it. So government imposes a quota on the quantity anybody can consume, and that means that when the budget line gets to this point, it becomes skint, right? So this is the new budget line. This area B is no longer available to the consumer due to the imposition of the quota, which is rationing. So I believe that with rationing, I mean power rationing is a typical example where in those instances, most people would even buy the product prepaid, but they don't get the power because it is not available for consumption at certain times. So that is it for this section. Basically, I would want you to, on your own, discuss the 3 types of subsidies that I listed in the slides and use diagrams to illustrate them. Thank you and all the best.